Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank Alan Packwood and the organizers of the 32nd International Churchill Conference for inviting me to talk to you this afternoon. It's a delight to be here with my friend, the copious annotator, Paul Courtney, whose deep learning about Churchill and all things English and also Great British has added so much to my own understanding. We're sorry that our colleague Warren Doctor was forced to leave because of the death of his grandfather in America. And it's a particular honor to have gotten to know the Imam Ahmed Abdel Rahman al-Mahdi, the grandson of Muhammad Ahmed the Mahdi, who's come to us from Khartoum, and to meet two other generations of his family here. I'm going to speak about a time in Churchill's early life, in 1898, when he first went to Africa as a young cavalry officer and war correspondent to take part in Britain's campaign against an Islamist regime in the Sudan. His 15 newspaper dispatches, written in purple ink in fountain pen after long marches through the Sahara Desert in the summer, on paper that he'd picked up at the British advisor's office in Cairo, in temperatures, he wrote, of more than 110 degrees, were published in the Morning Post in London. After serving in Africa, Churchill left the army, and he spent a year writing a book on the campaign. Of the 5 books that Churchill wrote before he entered Parliament at the age of 26, this is the most impressive. Churchill called it The River War. 3 years after it was published, as Paul was saying, he abridged the original book into a single volume for the second edition. And in that, 7 chapters disappeared completely, and passages were cut from every other chapter, including the passages about his own adventures and his controversial judgments. The full text of the book has been out of print since 1902. 25 years ago, as Paul said, it was while I was on my wedding trip in London, I began to prepare a new edition of The River War, which is now nearing completion and is going to be published in 2 volumes by St. Augustine's Press. On these slides, and also in the new edition in print, passages that were left out of the second edition are printed in red, while the passages that remained in the second edition are in black. And that way I thought you'd have some sense of the changes Churchill made and of what you've been missing if you've never read the 2-volume version of the River War. Churchill, whose regiment was stationed in India in 1898, got to the Sudan in time to ride in the cavalry charge in the climactic Battle of Omdurman across the river from Khartoum. High civilization in Egypt goes back, of course, thousands of years. It was all made possible by the river, without which Egypt would be only a desert. The river is the Nile, and the annual miracle of its life-giving flood captivated men even before the time of Cleopatra. I've borrowed Paul Clay's painting as the background for our slides this afternoon. Churchill was struck by the beauty of the sunsets on the Nile. He wrote in The River War that the wonderful flame pictures baffle memory and are beyond recall. Egypt is a strip of civilization along the Nile, broadening out into the delta just before it flows into the Mediterranean Sea. To remind you of the geography of northeastern Africa, the White Nile begins in the Great Lakes of Central Africa, losing water through evaporation as it flows leisurely through the jungle, choked with tangled vegetation called sood on its way north, which you may have some sense of if you've seen The African Queen. The Blue Nile, on the other hand, rises in the mountains of Ethiopia. When the snows melt, it comes rushing downstream through a canyon. And then the 2 branches of the Nile meet at Khartoum, the elephant's trunk. 4/5 of the water flowing downstream from Khartoum comes from the Blue Nile, which carries the silt that makes the Nile Delta so fertile. Only one other tributary then flows into the river north of Khartoum, the Atbara River, which dries up into disconnected stagnant pools in the summer. And then the Nile flows through the Sahara Desert for 800 miles without gaining one more drop of water. In the 19th century, slavery was the most important institution in the Sudan. After the fall of Napoleon, Egypt, which was nominally part of the Ottoman Empire, decided to become an imperial power in imitation of European imperialism. Even the pharaohs had never been able to conquer the Sudan. The Sahara Desert was a daunting obstacle. But in the early 1800s, an Egyptian army went up the Nile, captured Khartoum, and imposed a harsh rule on the Sudanese. The Egyptians took over the slave trade. Before long, the Sudanese rose in rebellion against Egyptian misrule. Muhammad Ahmed, the son of a boat builder and the grandfather of the imam with whom I'm sharing the platform today, became a prophet. He rallied his countrymen to throw off the invaders' corrupt version of Islam, and proclaiming himself the Mahdi, he aspired to make the whole world, including Cairo and Constantinople and even London, submit to the true faith. Churchill thinks the Sudanese had good cause to rebel because of the ill treatment they had suffered at the hands of the Egyptians. And his treatment of the Mahdi in the River War is remarkably generous. The first edition of the River War was illustrated by Angus MacNeill, a brother officer who, like Churchill, had gone to Harrow School. His drawings were left out of the second edition of the book, and they've never been reproduced in any other, but they're going to reappear in the new one. The Mahdi's followers called themselves the Ansar. The British called his soldiers the dervishes. The term means a religious mendicant who's taken vows of poverty and austerity. And here, MacNeill depicts a dervish spearman wearing his customary garb, a patched cloak or jibbah. Meanwhile, the Khedive, who ruled Egypt for the Ottoman Sultan, was a spendthrift. He borrowed huge sums from European lenders. These debts and the heavy taxes required to pay interest on them provoked a nationalist revolt in Egypt, led by an Egyptian army officer shown here, named Arabi Pasha. The Europeans, though, were afraid that the rebels would renege on the debt if they came to power, something like Syriza in Greece. The British and French governments agreed they would get together and suppress the revolt. But then, when the French fleet declined to take part in the campaign and instead sailed away, Britain became responsible for ruling Egypt. Sir Evelyn Baring, later Lord Cromer, was the British advisor to the Khedive, who ruled nominally for the Ottoman Sultan. What this meant is that the Khedive had to follow the advice he got from Cromer, who was later also a mentor to the young Churchill. Cromer tried to put the Egyptian economy on a solid foundation. To do that, he realized that Egypt would have to abandon the Sudan, despite the growing power of the Mahdi, because Egypt simply couldn't afford to keep it. Back in London, the Liberal administration of Prime Minister Gladstone urged Egypt to give up the Sudan. But evacuating Europeans in Khartoum became urgent as the Mahdist army surrounded the capital. Charles Gordon, who had made his name in China and had battled the slave trade as governor of the Sudan, was sent back to Khartoum to save the garrisons. But Gladstone sent him reluctantly, and he sent him without any support. At first, Gordon's reputation awed the dervish army, who were afraid that a British army would follow. But when they saw that Gordon was only one man on a camel, they tightened their grip on Khartoum. For his part, Gordon tried to hold the capital rather than evacuating the Europeans. Their situation became dire, but Gladstone was loath to lift a finger to help. An Austrian army officer, Rudolf Slatin, commanded an Egyptian army in Darfur. His soldiers became demoralized because their army was commanded by a Christian. So Slatin told them he was converting to Islam. But still, his Egyptians were no match for the dervishes, and Slatin was defeated and captured by the Mahdi. Slatin then wrote to Gordon, who desperately needed assistance from someone with his military capacity, offering to escape from the Mahdi, who held him in pretty loose confinement, and to join Gordon in defending Khartoum. But Gordon rejected his offer with contempt because, he said, Slatin had forsaken his God. Churchill criticizes Gordon, even though Gordon was admired as a Christian hero for rejecting this offer from Slatin. Gladstone was finally forced to send out 2 relief expeditions to save Gordon, one through the desert and another along the river. In the heat of the onslaught on Khartoum, Gordon was put to death by the dervishes, probably against the wishes of the Mahdi, who would rather have him taken prisoner. To his countrymen, Gordon became a martyr. His death left the British discouraged. The Mahdi was then triumphant in Khartoum and ruled over the Sudan. But a few months later, the Mahdi died, and he was succeeded by Abdullah, a soldier rather than a prophet, who became the caliph or khalifa. Churchill doesn't find him as sympathetic a figure as the Mahdi, but he admits that Abdullah did have some civilized qualities, and he's impressed with his statecraft. 6 years later, the Dervish Empire reached its greatest extent, ruling much of present-day Sudan and South Sudan, and slivers of Ethiopia and Eritrea as well. The British disbanded the old Egyptian army. A new Egyptian army grew up under British command. Herbert Kitchener became the Sirdar, or commander-in-chief, of this Anglo-Egyptian army. Kitchener's intelligence chief, and also an Austrian priest who was in dervish captivity, busily collected information about the Mahdist regime. Not only did this intelligence assist the eventual campaign to reconquer the Sudan, with Wingate's help, Ohrwalder published a book about the dervishes that shocked European readers. Slatin published another book after escaping from the Mahdi's camp, which was translated into English. And these 2 books helped turn public opinion in Britain in favor of helping Egypt to reconquer the Sudan. In the mid-1890s, a French expedition departed from Senegal, traversing the continent from west to east, and threatened to prevent a British Cape to Cairo railroad by creating an unbroken blue line of French colonies across Africa instead. And then, on the first day of March, 1896, the Ethiopians dealt a crushing defeat to an Italian army at Adowa, damaging the reputation of Europeans in Africa. 5 days later, Britain resolved to help Egypt reconquer the Sudan. The Anglo-Egyptian army, with British officers who commanded native Egyptian and Sudanese troops, crossed the border into the Sudan. Kitchener began his campaign by conquering the Sudan's northernmost province, Dongola, in 1896. The progress of the army was eagerly followed in Britain. Kitchener had the latest weapons, ironclad gunboats with machine guns and cannon. They followed the army south along the Nile, and McNeill's illustrations show advances in naval engineering between 1885 and 1898. But it was difficult to ascend the Nile, and the boats had to be towed or even disassembled and portaged by Canadian voyageurs around cataracts in the river. Local tribesmen were rounded up too. You can imagine what that was like, to help pull boats over the cataracts. Kitchener had to conduct the whole campaign on a very tight budget. To bypass a difficult stretch of the river along a big bend in the Nile, he decided to build a railroad across the Sahara Desert. Experts in England told him he couldn't build a railway across the desert in wartime. Kitchener decided to build it anyway, and his gamble paid off. When Kitchener needed more engines than England could supply, he bought them instead from America. And in the first edition of the River War, though not in the second, Churchill admits that American engines with interchangeable parts stood up better in the desert than British ones. By spring 1898, the Anglo-Egyptian army had reclaimed the Sudan along the Nile up to the Atbara River, defeating a dervish army there. Colonel Frank Rhodes, Cecil Rhodes's brother, is the man on the left in the pith helmet. He was the original editor of the River War, my predecessor. I don't think he did as much work on it. He wrote about 25 footnotes. Churchill, a young cavalry officer serving in India, followed the campaign attentively and was eager to be part of it. The climax was fast approaching. He enlisted his mother's help to get to Egypt. Churchill had had his baptism of fire in Cuba with Spanish forces in 1895. Then he had commanded troops for the Queen on the Indian frontier in 1897. The Indian campaign, of course, was the subject of his first book, which had just been published. By a stroke of luck, the Prime Minister, Lord Salisbury, who had not always been friendly to Churchill's father, happened to read Churchill's book and invited him to Downing Street for a chat. He offered to help Churchill, and our author quickly said, "I want to go to the Sudan." But Kitchener turned down the Prime Minister's request, just as he'd earlier turned down the entreaties of Churchill's mother. Only because his Anglo-Egyptian army was being augmented by some regular British troops was Kitchener able to take part in the campaign despite Kitchener's opposition. And he barely got to Africa in time for the climax. When the army drew near to Khartoum, Churchill could hear the drums and the notes of the ambia, a horn made from an elephant's trunk that helped keep up the good order and the morale of Abdullah's army. He was also impressed by the dervishes' battle flags, which marked parts of the Mahdist army, commanded by subordinate caliphs and emirs. They reminded him of the banners in the Bayeux tapestry. The climax of the campaign was the Battle of Omdurman. The Sirdar's gunboats and machine guns made it an unequal battle for the dervishes, who were mown down by the hundreds. Most of the British casualties took place among the 21st Lancers, who charged into a watercourse full of dervishes. In the hand-to-hand fighting, the odds were more even. Churchill, who fought with a brand new Mauser pistol instead of a sword because he'd injured his shoulder in India, suffered no harm to himself or to his horse. Even before the Anglo-Egyptian army entered the dervish capital of Omdurman, across the river from Khartoum, Kitchener's gunboats had done serious damage to the tomb of the Mahdi. Targeting the tomb was controversial, and Churchill was one of the critics. In the first edition of the River War, he writes a lengthy critique of Kitchener's bombardment of the tomb. Like many of his criticisms, though, you see it's in red here, it's softened in the abridged second edition. Churchill, who had noticed how the British treated native religions with respect in India, thought it a mistake to depart from that prudent policy in the Sudan. Churchill argues that if the British treat the Sudanese with savagery, then, unfortunately, they're no better than the dervishes. Eventually, after the Second World War, the British allowed the Sudanese to rebuild the tomb of the Mahdi, which became a place of pilgrimage. Because of his criticisms of Kitchener, Churchill damns him by faint praise in the first edition of the River War. Here's what he says, giving him the third place in the regeneration of the country, perhaps after Lord Cromer and perhaps also the Prime Minister, Lord Salisbury, to whom Churchill dedicated the first edition of the book. But in the second edition, that judgment about Kitchener is softened, as you can see. He's up to the second place. 2 days after the battle, a memorial service was held for Charles Gordon in the ruins of his palace in Khartoum. And at that service, Gordon's favorite hymn, "Abide With Me," was sung. You were supposed to hear it when the slide flipped, but I think the rhinoceros ate the sound. At any rate, you probably know it, but for the first time during the campaign also, as you can see in this photograph, the British raised a Union flag larger than the Egyptian flag, which is the same as the current flag of the Republic of Turkey. Churchill, however, slept through this memorial service. 3 days after the battle, he was awake, and he rode over the battlefield with a Scottish officer, Lord Tullibardine, the son of the Duke of Atholl. In one of the most unforgettable chapters of the book, which is entirely omitted from the abridged edition, he describes the suffering of the wounded dervishes who were neglected and still dying on the battlefield. His colleague did a little impromptu surgery on the knee of a wounded dervish, taking out the bullet with the button hook on his pocket knife. Later, Tullibardine enlisted help from friends, not including Churchill, so far as I can tell, in carrying spoils from the campaign back to his castle in the Highlands, where they decorate the banqueting hall. And more than that, he removed a copper emblem from the top of one of the cupolas of the Mahdi's tomb. You can see in the letter he wrote to his family where the emblem was taken down from the tomb in Omdurman, and he installed it on the clock tower of his own castle. Unfortunately, this clock tower burned down recently, and the emblem melted in the fire. So what you see in this photo is a reconstruction of the tower and a replica, not, I think, in the right metal, of the emblem that used to be at the top. Churchill left the Sudan soon after the battle, taking the desert railway north. But at a station in the desert, the train broke down. When the Arab engine driver attributed the delay to Allah, discerning some wise purpose, perhaps, in it, an officer of the Grenadier Guards, a man who had experience from his childhood driving trains, Lieutenant, or as the British say, Lieutenant Frederick Harvey Bathurst, rolled up his sleeves and got the engine moving again. Some of the officers thought his conduct was unbecoming for a British gentleman, but Churchill admired his ability. This episode provoked a Churchillian effusion in a chapter of the first edition that's omitted in the second. Here it is. This quotation has rocketed around the internet for about the last 14 years. And people have been puzzled because they've got the River War, looked for it, can't find it. It's because it's in one of the parts that was abridged out of the book in the second edition. Churchill may have left it out of the second edition because he thought it was impolitic. After all, the British Empire had, even then, millions of Muslim subjects. Last year, a British politician was even arrested for quoting this passage in public. But, you know, it's hard to object to Churchill's criticism of people who treat women as property. The passage, which readers look for in vain in the abridged edition, will be restored in the new one. Here's another passage from an early chapter of the River War, which is illustrated by Angus MacNeil with a drawing that people may find equally obnoxious. Some people think this passage shows that Churchill was a racist. The truth, though, is more complicated and more to Churchill's credit. He begins the River War by reflecting the widespread prejudice against black people, but then, as the book goes on, he deliberately undermines it. By the end of the book, having rejected this prejudice, Churchill argues that the 10th Sudanese, who were a black regiment in the Anglo-Egyptian army, ranks with the best troops of the empire, British or native. And in the passage I've highlighted, he even argues that their charge in a subsequent battle after Churchill had left the Sudan was finer than the charge of the 21st Lancers at Omdurman. Also, against the view among British officers that black soldiers wouldn't make good cavalry troopers, Churchill includes a footnote approving of the formation of black squadrons. What he's trying to do is to weaken prejudice by offering examples that disprove it. Churchill, thinking about the dervishes, denies that the dervish soldiers were mad fanatics for what they did in pitting their trashy weapons against the machine guns and the gunboats of a far more technologically advanced enemy. On the contrary, he claims that they were as brave men as ever walked the earth, and that they fought to the death because they were noble and honorable. His magnanimity to a defeated enemy was controversial when he published it, but it remained his lifelong view. Now here's a much older Churchill inspecting bomb damage in London during the Blitz. But notice Churchill's bravery and his oratory in the River War. This passage was written in 1898 in his dispatch for the Morning Post and reappeared in the River War, though it was cut out of the second edition. Here he was anticipating Britain's finest hour, more than 4 decades before he became the Prime Minister. Churchill spent a year after the campaign writing the River War, using his dispatches as raw material, but also studying the history of the Sudan. And in the book, he considered how Britain had changed the future of the Sudan by the reconquest. And he wondered whether that would help or hurt the people of the Sudan. In the River War, Churchill is lukewarm about imperialism, about grand projects of development, about higher education, about Christian missionary work, and about grasping entrepreneurs. And he thinks the country will need a long time to recover from the war. Before long, of course, he was elected to the House of Commons, where he took his seat as a member of Parliament. Then, more than half a century later, nearing the end of his political career, in October 1952, Churchill welcomed the Imam's father, the posthumous son of the Mahdi, to number 10 Downing Street, in anticipation of Sudanese independence, granted on the 1st of January, 1956. I thought you might enjoy seeing the title pages and the new frontispieces of the 2 volumes of the new edition of the River War. I'm grateful to Lady Soames, who wrote the foreword to the new edition, to Richard Langworth, who encouraged this project from the beginning, to Larry Arnn, the president of Hillsdale College, who arranged for both editions of the book to be scanned, to Bruce Fingerhut, my publisher at St. Augustine's Press, to Alan Packwood and all his staff over the years at the Churchill Archive Center for so much help in my research, beginning when Piers was the keeper, to the Churchill Center for encouragement, to Doug Russell for answers to military questions, to Tony Uloth for his assistance and understanding of the Sudan, and to my collaborator, Paul Courtney. And now it's my honor and great privilege to cede the lectern to my new friend and colleague, the Imam, the grandson of Muhammad Ahmed.